Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. We are in the final straight of the Drucker Forum, but still the best is yet to come. Thank you for choosing this panel. And we are going to talk about someone we haven't heard enough about, in my view, in the forum so far, and that is the human being. The human at the center of any human system, who we have tended, I think, a little bit to neglect in favor of talking about ecosystems, networks, and platforms in a rather abstract way. So we're going to try and bring this really home to everybody. And in a second development, if you've been to any of these parallel sessions, you'll know that we are not using Slido for audience interaction. We're actually going to interact with you live and ask you to ask questions in the traditional way with microphones. That means, because I'm very much a command and control chair of panels, that I will cut you short if you don't pose a question or make your statement extremely concise. So that is the only ground rule really today. I'm Andrew Hill from the Financial Times, a long-time ally of the Drucker Forum, and I have been thinking about the topics we're discussing today for at least the duration of my long career at the Financial Times, and particularly over the last 10 years or so as management editor. What we're going to try and do is talk about the frustration that arises in large organizations as they get larger, how they accrete bureaucracy, how they suppress some of the human potential that they should be releasing. And we're going to try and reach some conclusions about what sort of changes in the way in which organizations work could release more of that human potential. And we're going to explore how to achieve change, how to mitigate the risks involved in any change. And we're going to do that with the help of some very experienced panelists in the fields of collaboration, humanitarian action, innovation, gender balance, and beyond. Just one small bit of introduction from me. I've written a book this year about John Ruskin, the Victorian thinker, called Ruskinland. John Ruskin was very much somebody who saw how everything was connected. He was somebody, he wouldn't have called it a network, still less an ecosystem, but he saw how art, economics, science, history, the environment, all things that he was polymathically interested in were connected. And he very much saw the human in that system. He was very much about the coexistence of the human with the rest of the world, and particularly the happiness of people at work, something which strikes us now as rather a modern thought, but which he was already talking about in the 1850s. And he said something that I like to quote when I'm talking about the book, that there were three requirements for people to be happy at work. He said, they must be fit for it, they must not do too much of it, and they must have a sense of success in it, which I think is rather good, particularly the sense of success, because at work we very rarely achieve victory day to day. We edge towards this sense of success, and that seems to me to be a noble and, above all, an attainable goal for us while we're working. Anyway, I want to get to the panel and introduce them. You've got all their details, so I'm not going to take a long time to introduce them. We're going to speak roughly in this order. Michele Zanini is going to take the first take on this subject. Then I'll switch to Gianpiero Petriglieri from INSEAD, then Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and finally Bart Weetjens, who tells me there's been a lot of demand that he should show off his rats. From Apopo, the NGO, the innovative NGO he started. He hasn't brought a rodent with him, but there will be a short video, I hope, which will give you a little bit of a flavor of his work. But Michele, why don't you take the floor first?
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone, for selecting this wonderful panel. I'm sure you'll be happy with the results. I might be going on a limb here, but I think many of you would agree that the prevailing bureaucratic management model is no longer fit for purpose. I mean, that's, I think, why you're here at the Drucker Forum, to learn about alternatives. And, you know, it's because of this that most of our organizations aren't as adaptable, as innovative, and as engaging as they can be, and frankly, they need to be. Now some hope that we can increment our way to an alternative, like deploying agile methods. But as far as I can tell, most of these are bolted on, superficially applied, and limited in fashion. And so if history is any guide, these are unlikely to have a lasting impact. Just having your supervisor be called a scrum master isn't going to cut it, right? Let's be honest. We think that a lasting shift in management models requires radical change in individuals, in teams, and in the core processes by which our organizations are run. And in face of this challenge, the traditional approaches to change, frankly, even some of the ones we heard about in yesterday's last panel of the day, are inadequate. They're slow, they're incremental, they're clumsy, and they're needlessly antagonizing. And these are all artifacts of a bureaucratic model that assigns the responsibility for deep change to executives and their staff functions. So how do we change the way we change? Well, our view is that change must be broadly syndicated, just like Jos de Blok today talked about management being something that gets syndicated across the organization. Everyone must see themselves as a potential change leader. The task of rewriting the management code base, if you will, because that's what management is, it's an operating system, needs to be disaggregated, and small teams should be empowered to work on the individual components of it, much like Amazon or Google organize their software development into these little microservices teams. And we at the Management Lab call this approach a management hackathon. And to give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, let me just give you a very, very brief overview of an example coming from one of the largest consumer goods companies in the world. So they were facing revenue and margin declines in North America. The CEO and his team had run out of ideas on how to stem this. And so they said, well, let's just ask our people. So 4,000 employees in North America were asked to reimagine the company's management model and make it conducive to innovation as opposed to something that frustrates innovation. And they were invited to join a dedicated platform with a deceptively simple question. How do we wire pro-innovation principles into every management system and process that we have, that we use to run our organization? And the first few weeks of the hackathon focused on diagnosing the obstacles to innovation through surveys and a myriad of discussions and threads on the online discussion boards on the platform. But then the effort shifted to solutions and brainstorming potential things the company could change. And over the next few months, team members took part in 7 problem-solving sprints. Each was based and built around a specific principle of post-bureaucratic organizations. Principles like markets, openness, meritocracy, and ownership. And Alexander, if I could ask you to put up the first slide. Just to give you a sense, okay. So then what we did is we introduced participants to the principle with a short video lecture and some case studies. And then we asked them to brainstorm ways of operationalizing this principle across the various components of the management model. So things like resource allocation, talent management, compensation, and job design. So for instance, ideas contributed to the markets sprint included proposals for establishing VC-like investment pools in each business, or creating an internal stock market for ideas, or setting up an internal marketplace for short-term gigs, and improving sales forecasts through prediction markets. And through multiple rounds of peer reviews and voting that generated tens of thousands of rating actions and comments, the community converged on 16 ideas, or hacks as we call them, that were then fast-tracked for experimentation. And these ideas, which were only a small minority of the thousands of ideas that were generated, were then fast-tracked and supported in producing experiments over the next 90 days. They were given coaching, executive support, funding, $30,000, and a day a week off at least for every team member working on the experiment. Now, some of these experiments have scaled up, some are still being iterated, and some didn't work and they were abandoned. Collectively, their impact was pretty significant in terms of both the business results and the culture. And I think the key shift in my mind was the fact that people in the organization felt like they could change, they could organize around manage innovation, they could change the system, even though they weren't the owners of the levers of power in the organization. Now, to be sure, not every problem requires this kind of change process. You don't need a company-wide hackathon if your goal is to modernize your CRM system, right? There are plenty of well-tested recipes for that. But when you're trying to break new ground, when you're trying to deal with something that is really complex and systemic, or when you're challenging deeply entrenched interests, we think you need a process that has these kinds of attributes. It's open to everyone. Everyone can participate. It's informed by new principles that stretch your thinking and give you a sense of what's possible outside of the traditional canon. It's avowedly radical, but at the same time, it's judiciously experimental. It's highly generative. It's peer-regulated. It's the community that makes decisions, not some sort of top management team. And it's inescapable. That is, it's hard to reverse or unplug. And that's what happens when you mobilize thousands of people around a cause like this. So let's face it, change management, like band purse or Scottish cuisine, is an oxymoron, right? So there's no way a radical systemic change can be successfully designed and deployed from the top. So in the future, the most effective change efforts in our mind will be socially constructed. They won't cascade, they won't roll out, instead they will roll up. Thank you.
Thanks, Michele. Just one follow-up question. I mean, the bottom-up process sounds great, but it seems to me it potentially leaves the top-down organizations still in control of whether that happens, barring actual revolution, which I know Gary Hamel has been talking about for 25 or more years. How do you see the kind of level of bubbling up, bottom-up change in big organizations? How do people reach that point where they can get to a solution of the sort that you've devised?
It's a very good question. And you're absolutely right that traditionally, bottom-up change processes generate a lot of commitment, a lot of creativity, but then have a hard time scaling because it doesn't take much for someone to just terminate them, or let's say there's a supporting manager that is hosting the experiment in their part of the organization, that person leaves, and then the whole thing is done. So what we try to do, and we're by far not the only ones, is to leverage the scale that you can get horizontally across the entire company by inviting people to join a collaborative platform online. It just creates a critical mass that then becomes really difficult for management to stop. It's really hard to, it's really easy to extinguish a small experiment with 50 people in a remote corner of the organization, but when this is a highly public conversation with 4,000 people, literally everyone in the company investing time and effort into this, it's much harder to walk back. And so this is something that I think technology allows us to do, and enabling the coordinated action and the wisdom of the crowd to be leveraged in a way that couldn't have been done 20 years ago.
Okay, thank you. Gianpiero, do you want to take this on?
Yes.
Take another angle.
First of all, let me say I'm also really delighted to be here at the Drucker Forum. In that way, an academic is delighted to be in a place where what people talk about seems to confirm the finding of his research. So it's great to kind of, I've been here for the last couple of days, really hearing something that's been preoccupying me for a while, which is in all this disruption, in all this change in the structure and the culture of work, what happens to our experience of work? And that's kind of what I want to focus on. And without putting too fine a point on it, it seems that all these changes are doing two things to our experience of work. They are freeing us up potentially, and they're freaking us out for sure. And so, and I've been kind of listening at the subtext, because I think this panel's theme of the human potential in ecosystems has also been a subtext of many of the other panels, and questions have been raised in different form. There's the depressive question, which is, will we survive? And in which conditions? Then there's the neurotic question, which I think we've been asking here, which is, will we matter at all in these new digital dispersed ecosystems? And then there's the grandiose questions. Will we be in charge? And if you allow me to really reduce them, to simplify them, the question is, will we die? Will we be free? And will we command? These are, if you look at these three questions, these are traditional existential questions. And I want to submit that we are actually a very poor tools in our management theories, in our management practices, which are so instrumental in nature. We can answer very well questions like, will we be productive? Will we be liked? Maybe even, will we be happy? These are instrumental issues, but they're not existential issues. And I think at moments like this is an existential moment. And we need to think about it and maybe to treat it as such. It's not new. Whenever there are big social changes, the existential question always comes up because at the end of the day, there's nothing natural about human nature. It's a social construct. And we have to reinvent it and reimagine it every time there are profound shifts. Because at the end of the day, if you want it to be really basic, what is a human being? Is a monkey with consciousness and fragile enough that it needs other people. So once you're a monkey with consciousness that needs other people, one is you're primed to ask yourself, what does it mean to be human? And two is you're primed to answer that question in a way that agrees with others, which we call culture. And if you think about it, 300 years ago, what it meant to be human was to belong to something. We actually answered the question of human nature purely through a tribal lens. Up until a few centuries ago, where you were born determined who you were, who you married, how you lived, what work you would do, pretty much everything. Eventually, that got elaborated a bit more in institutions like the church and the military, where basically if you're one of us, you're human, and if you're not one of us, you're subhuman. That's the tribal logic. Came the Industrial Revolution, things shifted dramatically, power of the churches and militaries diminished, and then roll in nation states and corporations, which for all their issues have really progressed towards democracy. And here the question of what makes us human is answered differently, is answered by what you make of yourself and what you make for others. And so the question is how we exercise choice. Suddenly, we have a definition of humanity which is based on our freedom of choice and how we use it responsibly rather than on our loyalty and our access to belong to certain powers. Purpose is no longer something that's infused from above. It's something you have to search and find and all of that. And these are two different ways of answering the question of what human nature is and how you express it, how you live a good life. One is based on what makes us alike, and one is based on what makes us unique. And psychologists say the reason why we've culturally anchored on this, because it responds to some very fundamental psychological needs. One is the need to belong, and the other one is the need to be free, the need to have some agency. And belonging and agency are really the two pillars of humanity. And when we dehumanize others, we either tell them that they don't belong, or we restrict their choices dramatically. Avivah will talk about this, I'm sure. And what's interesting about the new ecosystems that are coming up, in my view, is that they actually raise the question of, is it possible that the conception of humanity that we need is one in which there is agency in belonging? And I think if you look at very simplistically, the question we're asking in this kind of large digital ecosystems is, will we be able to make friends? Or how free will my choices really be? And we see pseudo answers. We see populism or kind of elite entrenchment, which are kind of modern forms of tribalism. We see a profound epidemic of loneliness or some kind of rugged individualism, which are kind of proto-forms of agency. But I don't think we really have wrestled with the question of who are we becoming and with whom. And so I know, Andrew's going to ask us at the panel, and I have prepared for that, what should we do? But I actually think that's a secondary question. The question is, who are we becoming? How can we imagine who are we becoming and then act accordingly? And one thing I'm going to kind of leave us with, and one of the things I've been trying to articulate is perhaps if we want a definition of humanity that's based on agency in community, if we really, in these ecosystems, want to have kind of human connections, and I mean real human connections, the one when we can be not flat, unilateral, but where we can be messy and be hopeful. And we also want agency, we want some kind of freedom. Then what I think we need a different metaphor for work or for leadership, because we've had the metaphor of the military general, we've had the metaphor of the saint, we've had the metaphor of the entrepreneur, and I think we really need to consider seriously the metaphor of the artist. Because artists have always been preoccupied with doing something that was utterly free and at the same time profoundly cultural. Something that was personal, but at the same time did something not just to others, but for others' behalf. Something that was marketable, that certainly made you a living. Artists are very, very practical people. but also that adds some beauty, that adds some meaning. And I think the first thing we need to do is to kind of stop the tyranny of thinking that if we are preoccupied with becoming and with meaning, it means we're not practical. I think there's, Kurt Lewin used to say, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. Well, the same is true. There's nothing as human as a good story. And I think perhaps the issue now is we don't need another theory of management. We need a different story of management, as Peter Drucker maybe would have said, if we are to figure out what it means to be human in ecosystems as much as then what will we do in them.
Thank you very much, Gianpiero. Thank you. Avivah, tell us your take on where we've got to and just how far we've still got to go in this transformation.
Well, I'm going to go a little bit simpler and to the root of humans. So I'm going to talk to you about babies. Maybe how many of you in the room have had babies? Okay. That's a little bit more, perhaps, than the Austrian average, which is a fertility rate now down to 1.5 babies per woman. The replacement ratio for countries is 2.1. So what we're seeing in the world today is 46 countries that are shrinking demographically. And the vast mass of countries are aging and not reproducing. So what's going on? A lot of press about technology. A lot of this conference has been talking about new technologies and the future and AI. I want to point you backwards to an old technology. It's called the contraceptive pill. And Peter Drucker said that very often technologies only hit with consequences decades after their invention. So this is one that is having consequences now. Women are increasingly voting quietly with their wombs. And so the ecosystem of our humanity, based on rebirth and recreation, is actually being halted because, I would suggest, countries aren't really adapting and organizing for the last 50 years, which has seen the massive arrival of women into talent pools, labor forces, and financial independence. And a generation or two ago, if you forced women to choose between work and family, they chose family. And they didn't participate in the labor force. A generation later, now, you force women to choose in countries because you haven't introduced policies and systems to conciliate parenting and work. They choose work. And we're seeing entire countries where women are no longer having children and sticking and preferring work, and they're not even getting married. This is particularly true in women-unfriendly countries where really one part of the population isn't adapting. So if you look into Asia in particular, South Korea, Japan, you're seeing a phenomenon of what The Economist called the lonely hearts of Asia, where humans aren't even coupling anymore, let alone reproducing. So how does that translate into the world of work? It's a little bit the same. Countries are, on this issue, very influenced by their leadership. And there are a few countries that are demographically remaining quite healthy if their leaders are paying attention to this issue. But you can also see that there's been, I would suggest, a huge reaction to the rise of women politically, which is seeing the rise of macho, strong men that are not good, certainly not for women or birth rates, but they're not good for anybody. They're not good for democracy. So women are only really the canary in the mine. And wherever women are not reproducing, you can bet that the men aren't in a very healthy frame of mind either. And the same is true exactly, I would argue, in companies and organizations. Companies have been largely created, designed, and organized by men for men. And when they saw this massive arrival of women into the labor force, they let them into organizations and said, you know, we're a meritocracy, you're all allowed in. But they didn't adapt very much. And so women were allowed in basically in exact measure to how much they were willing and able to become men. And you'll find in a lot of organizations today that some of the women, particularly in the more senior roles, bear a very close resemblance to the dominant group. And that culture, that ecosystem inside organizations is still very heavily and often totally unconsciously male-normed, male-designed, and the systems support a very masculine set of values. And we're talking lots and lots now about purpose and inclusion. But look at the way companies are organizing the issue of gender balance. I was just telling Andrew, why is it that companies across the globe are now saying that they believe in diversity? Ladies, when did we, 60% of the talent, 80% of consumer buying decisions, when did we become a diversity dimension? Do you agree? Because that is a set-up to fail ecosystem. It means that women are one minority among many to be managed with a little ERG or affinity group, so that we make multiple little ecosystems of separateness and identity rather than a common group of shared purpose and vision. Women will profoundly change the cultures, values, systems, and mindsets of organizations, but only if they're fully allowed in and adapted to and designed. And this doesn't mean being gender blind. It doesn't mean that you're going to say, I don't care if anybody's a man, a woman, or the 52 other genders now on offer. It's much more like, excuse me if you're Chinese in the room, it's much more like the rise of China. If you want to work with the Chinese, if you want to sell to the Chinese, if you want to develop Chinese people in among your leadership, you better learn the language and culture of the Chinese. If you want to work with women, you want to sell to women, you want to promote women in your organizations, you better learn the language and culture of women. That requires becoming gender bilingual, not gender blind. And our ecosystems for the moment are in organizations convinced that they are meritocracies when actually they're largely just blind, one-footed, in a world that is increasingly gender balanced. So I'd just like to celebrate this particular conference. The Peter Drucker conference has become, in the few years that I haven't been here, one of the most gender-balanced management conferences I've ever seen. And it's still very rare. So this is what it feels like. What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you, Avivah. Let me just ask Avivah, just as a follow-up, is there an organization apart from this conference that you can think of that has achieved from a traditional base progress towards the gender balance, the gender bilingualism that you lay out? Can you think of anywhere that has done that?
people always want names. There are lots of companies that have progressed. I don't think yet you're going to find organizations that are fully gender bilingual. And I also challenge, I'm increasingly hearing women very proud of the female-dominated ecosystems they've created in business, but that's no more balanced than the male-dominated version. And neither domination is healthy or inclusive.
Right.
So I struggle on both ends of the gender spectrum to embrace balance as a goal at country level, at company level, and at couple level.
Yes.
And that's still a stretch. We're working our way there.
Can I just maybe
Yes,
add one
Michele,
thing?
chip in,
Andrew?
and then I'll come to Bart.
So maybe one proxy for the balance, I'm not sure if you agree, Avivah, is companies that base their entire culture and values on the value of love, right? So, and there are at least a couple in my mind. I don't know if they're paragons of, of the kind of end state you're aspiring for, but Southwest Airlines would be one, and another one, Whole Foods pre-Amazon. I don't know where they are right now, but they are based on this model that it has more to do with Mary Parker Follett of power with as opposed to power over, which is relational. And based on community and trust, which I guess you could argue is less masculine, right? I don't know if it's feminine, but certainly it's quite different. So I wonder if you agree that that might be a good proxy. A company that says where people can talk about love and can embrace who they are and trust each other more than you would in a typical company.
I certainly would argue that the word love is not something you often hear in business or on management daises, so thank you for bringing it up. I think when that word starts appearing, you're definitely getting into a different set. I'd say that what you do find is purpose-driven companies that actually point to their mission, an inspiring mission as their driving force for everybody, are always going to attract more gender-balanced talent than the ones that are driven by what we've been dominated now for decades: shareholder value, money, Wall Street, quarterly results. The vocabulary is very key. So yes, when you start hearing more about love than profits, I can guarantee there are going to be more women in the room.
Thank you, Avivah. Somebody asked before this panel whether I'd ever done a panel with 2 Italians on it, and now I see what that involves. Amore comes in before we've even got to the halfway mark. Okay, Bart, tell us a little bit about your journey with Apopo and what you've learned to bring this to the.
Sure, but first I
theme.
simply need to share that I'm full of awe of what you just shared, Avivah, and. Well, I think this is really subject for another panel with 4 ladies and 1 man next year.
I don't know. I think it's you guys that need to talk about this.
No, we need to learn. Really, we need to learn. I identify as a man, and
there have been enough panels
so
of
much.
women talking about gender balance. Now it's good that it's a panel of men.
So thank you so much for that. Yeah, my journey is actually one of love, and thanks for that hint, because that's really the word that it is about. I'm a Zen Buddhist priest, and you saw that rat on my shoulder. I'm actually a product designer by training, and I quit the industry because I wasn't really happy. And I've pursued a life of purpose and meaning. Traveling in Africa, I was very much baffled by the dependency of subsistence farmers community in countries like Angola or Mozambique, who are completely dependent on expensive imported know-how and technology to tackle one of the most, the biggest scourges that are currently there, which is the problem of landmines, which occurs still in over 50 countries worldwide. Affects at scale communities that have to flee from their villages and live in refugee camps or in slums around cities. I started a research project, first of all with the design approach, looking from the end user point of view, so placing myself in the situation of these subsistence farmers, what resources would they have at hand, and then looking at various things, and mainly natural resources. I came across my childhood buddies, rats. As a boy, I bred all kinds of mice and hamsters and rats and gerbils and sold them to pet shops for pocket money. And when I read an article of American scientists who had done an experiment, not very sustainable, with electrodes in the brain of these animals, conditioning them by electrical brain stimulation to discriminate the scent of explosives, I knew I was going to train rats to tackle the landmine problem. And that's what I did. With a grant from the Belgian government, we started a research program. We moved it to Tanzania in a stable environment where, together with the Tanzanians, we developed this technology up to, well, corresponding international mine action standards, and then started deploying it with lots of challenges, and that's where the ecosystem issue comes in, and I'll maybe expand a bit later on that, but some of you, actually many of you, asked to actually have a glimpse of those rats, and I can only refer here to the Vienna Zoo, where in the Rattenhaus they use, I'm not sure they still have it, but they used to have an exhibit with the hero rats, as we call them. But I brought a small video, and Alexander, maybe you can put it up so people can actually see how this goes. It's a very appropriate, simple technology, where with which, and I think Alexander, if you can get that video, that would be wonderful. With just these trained rats, renewable resource, and of course, some of you may think like, okay, these rats blow up, so we get rid of 2 problems at once. But that's not how it works. So these rats are very precious. They're conditioned through positive behavior reinforcement. But using this simple approach with expert African village trainers, we can reduce the cost per square meter of suspected land from an average of $1 to about 30 cents. Can you imagine? So it's a cost reduction, incredible cost reduction. Using this technology, and look well now, so the trainer is in a safe area, he makes like incremental steps of ½ a meter distance. This giant African pouched rat smells something there and starts scratching the soil. Then hears a click sound, which means he can come and get a food reinforcer, which in this case is banana, I think. It's as simple as this.
Wow.
You know, using 2 animals in a row, you can have an enormous increase in speed compared to metal detectors, and integrated in an innovative land release methodology approach, we can speed up mine action considerably. Actually, we cleared the whole of Mozambique. The whole country was declared landmine free 2.5 years ahead of the country's scheduling, thanks to these hero rats.
So Bart, I mean, to stick with you, you talked when we were preparing the session about the frustrations of this process, because clearly in any country you're dealing with bureaucracies, governments, other organizations in the same area. What have you learnt about the way in which human, and in this case rodent, potential is being impeded by organizational friction, if you like?
Yes, indeed. That's the interesting question. You would expect, if you come up with a technology like this, that immediately it would penetrate the market and it would be adopted everywhere. However, the humanitarian mine action market is not your typical market, and market mechanisms don't apply. It basically is a public and private philanthropic donor-funded market. It's a small market. It's only around $400 to $800 million going every year to humanitarian mine action. And there is a handful of organizations competing for that basket of funding to maximize. And instead of looking at the output, the ultimate goal here is a world without landmines, you know, a world without fear, where subsistence farmers can enter into their villages and their agricultural land. Instead of looking at that, there is huge investment of these organizations in capacity building around fundraising, where the resources should actually go to alleviate the problem. Landmine action is traditionally a very conservative thing. It is dangerous, you know, dealing with landmines. There are explosives, accidents occur. It is very tedious. It's lonesome. and costly. And the whole thing is adoption of new technologies takes time, and much more than we can anticipate. The real challenge here is to build momentum for these organizations to work together, and rather than looking at the problem in a rather egoistic way, so at an organizational level, in a sense of disconnection, of separation, and unhealthy competition. If we would collaborate, we could actually get rid of the landmine problem in 30 years from now. It would require around 70 to 80 million being invested in this innovative land release approach, but basically all these organizations would also be out of business. And so that's the difficulty. Is it our own interest we are working on, or is it the ultimate goal we are working on?
Right, thank you. Let me just flip back to Gianpiero, because there's I think, a sort of linking theme here that I'd like to try and draw out before we open to the audience for questions. And that is this belonging and agency, or as you put it right at the beginning, the sort of fear versus freedom part of many organizations. I mean, clearly we're talking here to some degree about large organizations that have accreted, as Michele and Gary Hamel have looked at, bureaucracy and become cumbersome and difficult for human potential, at the same time embedding the bias that Avivah mentions. But I mean, there are some advantages to the belonging part. If you could say that the belonging is has been the exaggerated part of corporate organizations in particular.
And not just because I think a lot of large organizations have also at least tried to become more inclusive, at least try to become more democratic, certainly in very imperfect ways. I mean, you were asking earlier about companies that make efforts on diversity. Your newspaper has just ranked 50 of them very publicly. I think, obviously for a long time, people in my business were worried about the iron cage, the way these organizations were really kind of suffocating us and shrinking our souls. And then they all started loosening up, and we realized that just like you can have too much control, you can also have too much freedom, to the extent that you become isolated and anxious. And I think if you look at people that now labor in precarious conditions in the gig economy, I don't know if they are often less worried than people who labored in large organizations were. It's just that instead of having too much control, sometimes they have too little. And so, I think one of the arguments that everyone here is making is about the need for organizing that is neither stifling or neglectful. Because, for example, we used to worry about bureaucracy. And now we've got, algorithmic capitalism, which is making possible levels of control that Frederick Taylor would not have dreamt of.
Right.
That Frederick Taylor would not have dreamt of with all his bureaucratic things. So it's not like because we have ecosystems, we have given up rational controls. It's not because we have ecosystems we've given up cultural control. And I think, especially resonating with what Avivah is saying, is the question is not are structures good or bad, is what do our structures do and for whom? Because, for example, in some places, some people get liberated and some people get oppressed. So I would say, if anything, we have to think about, I mean, if you really wanted to take the agency and belonging, and sometimes I would ask executives, does our organization allow us to make work that resemble us and make friends who don't? Or is it the other way around, that we're actually making work that doesn't look like us, that we have no connection, and only make friends who look like us? Because if that's where we're being driven, then really that's dehumanizing. And if we're being driven to make work that looks like us and make friends who don't, then I think the work is humanizing. And I think that's kind of the point Avivah and others are trying to make. And when I read Avivah's work, and of course, I will declare myself a feminist, not because it's a movement against men, or it's a movement against domination. And any kind of any kind of change in the workplace that doesn't change structures of domination cannot be called progress, other than perhaps from under the strictest utilitarian lenses.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, Andrew, can I just challenge
Michele.
the premise that there is a trade-off between agency and belonging?
Right. Well, it's not. I mean, I don't think it's a zero-sum.
Or
Of course
that,
it's not.
or that there's a deeply felt sense of belonging in when you're like 8 layers down in an organization where you have very little control over your daily life. I mean, I think the best organizations are organizations where it feels like a community, feels like a family, but at the same time you have the ability to set your own path, right? I mean, and that's the kind of organization we should aspire to have.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
And families are complicated places. Families are
absolutely.
complicated places.
yeah, I worry a bit about family as a metaphor for organizations,
Some of us
the
have
dysfunction that some families experience.
some of us have had difficult experiences in families. In fact, if you work, if you come from I come from the business psychotherapy, where people usually came to kind of work through something that happened in their families or something that happened at work.
Right. Avivah, I mean,
But I would argue that parenting skills and leadership skills are very, very transferable, and lousy parents make lousy leaders.
Avivah, I think we
Yeah,
need to
you
be
wanna go there?
careful.
Go
We
ahead.
gotta be careful. We gotta be careful
Okay,
with that.
come on.
I think there's a verticality of power implicit in the parenting metaphor that is risky. That is risky, and I think we need to think of.
I think parenting is evolving just like leadership is, in the same direction. So I think skilled parents are doing exactly what you're
Yes.
saying, combining belonging and agency in very skilled ways. So healthy children come from very skilled parents, I would argue. And a lot of the dysfunctions you
I
find
would
in-
argue, but there is structure. Your children can sign checks from your bank account.
okay, I think we're going to take the family discussion offline. But Avivah, I do have a question about the.
Yep.
I mean, whether there is, what is the structure? We're talking a bit about structure here, and the humans within organizations. I mean, is there some form of the business organization, mainly talking about business organizations, also non-profit, which is best for allowing this level of balance between agency and belonging that, in fact, in your work would most encourage the gender bilingualism that you've mentioned? I mean, is there something that is out
Yes,
there?
absolutely. I think what you've been hearing here about the shift from what I call pyramids to pomegranates, right? From top-down, heavy, autocratic, 8 layers, 10 layers, 15 layers down that you're not belonging to anything, to what we're talking about, much more flattened, networked organizations that are going to pick up a different vocabulary of what the system feels like. And I would say that if it feels more like a family infused with love, if you're able to know the people that you work with, so limited in size, they say it's 150 people, if you still know their names or not, you're going to feel more like you belong. And with a real recognized role and contribution to the mission that you understand and share. This is not rocket science, right? And I think it's just as true in your family as it is in your work. So I think, yes, we're heading that way, some organizations, but as people have been describing, especially global organizations, they are pendulum swinging between centralization and decentralization, and when they manage to start identifying a shared platform of resources, which could be a metaphor of the fridge full of food, but then a lot of projects and countries and geographies going off in relatively entrepreneurial forms.
Right, I'm going to come to the audience in 1 minute, but I just want Bart, as the person on the panel who is talking about an organization that you started, whether you had any of this thought about the type of organization you wish to have or preside over. I don't know what the best way of describing your leadership style is, but have you created something that where you can see some of the disadvantages that Michele and the others have outlined beginning to emerge in your own organization?
Definitely. Well, I was close to burnout on this particular aspect, because I strongly believe, like, we have a technology that can be so cost reduction, it's impossible to be constantly donor dependent, right? And even if we're like in the Geneva rating, we were number 11 when I left. Well, I'm still on the board, but when I left as an executive, and that is the criteria is sustainability. Personally, I don't share the vision that an NGO is financially sustainable because it's constantly depending on public funding and goodwill, right? So looking at this, I'm convinced there are models, and there are a number of them in these social enterprise networks, like the B Lab, for instance, is an example of hybrid structures that embrace both. And I'm even shying away from the word profit, have financial sustainability and have human sustainability. Yeah. And it's always a trade-off between meaning, purpose, belonging, as you call it, and then on the other side, the need for financial balance and the single bottom line. But it is possible. And there's numbers of like, if you look, for instance, at the B Lab, at the B course, what they are doing, or social enterprises within the Ashoka networks, or the Schwab network to the World Economic Forum, or the Skoll community. There's numbers of examples of that. Myself, I felt I failed so far. I stepped down for those reasons. And I'm delighted to see that now, 5 years later, the organization is actually taking concrete steps to set up a for-profit on the side of the non-profit.
Right. I'm going to go to the audience now just to take some questions in, and then we'll come back onto the panel if there are there must be something that has been provoked among the audience for questions, concise ones, right here. I can't see very clearly. Somebody at the front here. Yes. We've got a microphone for you.
Thank you. I'm addressing to Avivah. You provoked my thought. I'm mother of 2 children, and with your statement that you said that the birth is decreasing by the woman's 1.5, correct me if I'm wrong. So in ecosystems, the technology is almost primary that is being discussed. And by having technology, is also, it means to us that we will have mobility, working from home possibility. And shouldn't this be kind of boost for the women to have more, to give more birth, because they could also be engaged in their work and also raise the family?
Yes, and I think the biggest boost to women's labor force participation combined with healthy birth rates will be the gender balancing of parenthood, which is coming through shared parental leave. So as long as women claim parenthood, we're going to fail. We're going to fail at trying to have both purpose, meaning, and work in our lives along with families. So I think shared parental leave is spreading. Half of OECD countries now have at least 2 months of paternity leave. The challenge now is a leadership one in organizations that the charming, generally boomer generation gentlemen running many of these organizations are rather reluctant to recognize that younger millennial men actually would like to be fathers. So talk about freedom. Please free your young men to go home and father. That will be the best thing you can do to promote the women in your organization to be leaders.
Thank you. More questions? There's one right over on the other side. And actually, where is the microphone? Just here? We'll just go to here, and then I can see one right over there. So we'll just start with this side, and then we'll come to you at the nearer the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, hello, Michele. One question to you. In your studies, or did you discover any differences between areas like production, so with a high proportion of blue collars, and let's say delivery, orientation, and other areas?
Can you say a little bit more? What kind of differences were you thinking about?
On releasing the human potential.
Well, in fact, some of the more moving and inspiring cases have been very much at the level of the production floor, shop floor, blue-collar workers. I'll give you one example. This comes from a fairly well-known company called Nucor. They're the largest steel maker in the United States. It's 25,000 people. They have an incredibly small number of managers because the person that set it up in the 60s built it on the premise that the genius of the organization lies at the bottom, not at the top. So you might go to one of their plants, $2 billion of enterprise value, 1,500 people, 7 managers. Everybody else is a blue-collar worker. They have the autonomy to run processes, to make decisions around suppliers, equipment purchases, and the like. They get paid for their productivity. They have a tremendous amount of training, not only technical training, but also business training. Everybody knows what the return on assets of the plants is, what working capital is. They go through a business curriculum that would make INSEAD and other business schools feel nod with a lot of approval. And so they're, and it's we talked about the fear of automation and Taylorism and so on. They're the most productive steelmaker in the country and maybe even in the world, and the biggest adopter of automation. And the reason for that is because people that work there get paid on productivity. They get weekly bonuses based on how much more than the rated capacity they can squeeze out of the assets that they have. And they're the first ones who are going to generate ideas. Because another thing that is part of their social contract is that if you do a good job, you'll have it tomorrow. So they've never laid anybody off in a highly cyclical environment. They never laid anyone off. I mean, they fire you if you're incompetent. But, and I wish, more people that are worried about the future of work looked at companies like that as opposed to others. Because I think if we emulated some of their practices and principles, we wouldn't necessarily have this conversation.
Thank you. So somebody's got the mic near the back there.
Yes, sorry, that's me.
Ah.
So coming back also to the theme of the human potential, I would like to ask all of you in the panel, of all the sort of qualities that make us uniquely human, which do you think will be the most important in the coming years?
Okay, I'm going to actually just pause that question and use it as the final roundup from individual panel members. If there's one more question in the room before that. Somebody else have a different question? It's a great question, but I want to use it. Yes, at the front here.
Hello. So I was quite surprised so late in the conference to hear first about design approaches, because in design or design thinking, we've taken this multi-perspective view and taking the human in the center quite for a long time. Maybe it's easier because we're designing for a consumer who pays money, so we can accept that they are irrational and that they behave according to their needs. And now we start to adopt the same notion of humans now in management. So is there something specific that you see that we can learn from design approaches, from design studies, that we can also take for management? And I think hackathons, as Michele has presented it, might go in that direction.
Who'd like to pick that up? Gianpiero?
I mean, I think, honestly, the design thinking is a proxy for our desire for art, for a more artistic approach to business. So I would say it's attention to bodies, that humans have bodies. They don't just have thoughts and feelings. They have bodies in space, that bodies move in space with other people. And also, it's real effort to, as Bart was saying, to balance the tension between the instrumental, the need to get something done, and the humanistic, the need to create a certain experience. And I think design thinking takes that tension to a certain, and to take into to an extreme. I think it also allows for the possibility that as a human, you might actually have pain and love at the same time, as opposed to just have one at any point in time.
And Gianpiero, do you want to start the final round by giving us a human quality that you think is the most important
qualities
to release from the iron cage?
I mean, I would say curiosity and compassion in equal measure. I think it's very easy to have compassion without curiosity, be very paranoid, defensive. It's very easy to have curiosity without compassion, be very detached and technocratic. But I think the curiosity and compassion together, even if they make you a little bit more confused, that they make you more human, both in who you are and what you do.
Okay, Avivah?
I'll give 2 options that I think are always the driving energy behind so many changes I see. Is it love or is it fear? And I think if we can get a little bit more of us on the side of love, to calm some of the fears we see rising and roiling across our world, that's where we're going to be okay.
Okay, Michele?
I would second love, and I would also say self-direction.
Okay. And Bart?
I would say the ultimate potential here is our capability to embrace interconnectedness as a way to overcome that incredible delusion that we all share, the delusion of ego, of a kind of separated self from the universe, which then results in ignorance, greed, hatred. So yeah, I would say really we have that potential to overcome ego by embracing, to put it in one African word, Ubuntu.
Ubuntu. Very nice way to end. I was going to say connectedness myself, bringing us round full circle to where I started. Thank you for your questions, and I'd like to thank the panel for bringing us more art, more sustainability, more purpose, and more love, and for giving at least me a sense of success in this particular panel session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.